arranged by Camden and North West London branches. And as usual, Comrade will speak, and after that we have questions and discussion, refreshments as well later. So, without more ado, I call upon Comrade Hardy to begin his lecture.
I want to tell Comrade, at the forthcoming general election time, among the other things is whether they approve or disapprove of the Thatcher government action in privatising, as they call it, and that's setting them back to perhaps to operate. The Tories will say that privatising them will be good for everybody, and the Labour Party will retort that it's bad for everybody. This is, of course, the loose way politicians talk, because almost all the things that governments ever do are good for some section of the population and bad for some others. Well, we're going to answer this question in relation to nationalisation, privatisation. Nationalisation is the special form of the Labour Party, a statement which is quite untrue. The Liberal and Tory governments were nationalising before the Labour Party was formed. The present Tory government, the Tories started it and the Liberals finished it, and they both accepted it, the normal practice from something like half a century. Tory and Liberal governments in the past nationalised some industries to achieve a particular object. Whereas they were behaving rationally and as responsibility for running capitalism. Now, Tories have decided in the century no longer serves their purpose, because the party in this country that has never advocated nationalisation or supported nationalisation or defended nationalisation is the party of Great Britain. And likewise, if we advocated, defended or supported private enterprise, our object is capitalism, not to play about with ways in which capitalism can be operated. First, a word as to what exactly nationalisation means. An industry or service is said to be nationalised when it's taken out of the hands of private owners and is owned and operated by the government either directly, as its department, or indirectly through setting up a public like rail or coal board and having them run the industry on the part of the government. In the 19th century, the postal, telegraph and telephone services were operated by the post office as a government department. The staff were civil servants, and they were just like any other government department with certain differences. Later, nationalisation took the form of what they call public boards, as when the Labour government in 1945 took over coal, steel, railways and various other industries. The theory is, about these nationalised boards, the government provides the finance, say of the coal board or British Rail, and exercising control, but the day-to-day operation of the steel industry is supposed to be left in the hands of the members of the board itself. The government, of course, appoints the members of the board and can remove them if at any time they want, usually appoint them for 3 years and then replace them by somebody else. Now, the same kind of organisation exists when local authorities operate commercial services, such as water supply, bus services and council houses. There is one municipality in this country, Hull, which also operates a telephone service by licence from the post office, from British Telecom. That's the city of Hull. Back in 1889, when the Fabian Society, which is affiliated to the Labour Party now, they've always provided a lot of the theorising for the Labour Party, they published Fabian essays in 1889, and they held out the prospect that the local authorities would take over a whole range of services, and ration has not been fulfilled. And as I say, the kind of operations run by local authorities have fairly narrowly restricted. That's just an accident. But as far as the government itself is concerned, there has been a whole lot of nationalisation. I've mentioned some of the commercial industries and services, coal and railways and steel, that have been nationalised, but there are a lot of other fields which in the past 150 years the government has taken over that were formerly carried on by private individuals. And I have in mind health service, the education service, the turnpike roads, unemployment and old age pensions. At one time, what education people got, they paid for themselves, they paid schools, or they went to the church charity schools, or they got no education at all. For health, they paid doctors or hospitals, though the hospitals were largely dependent also on donations given to them by the public. And until the government took over road building, part of the provision for trunk roads was in the hand of private companies. They were called the Turnpike Trust. The capitalists would get together, set up a turnpike trust, take over the building of some miles of roads, and they got their profit by charging users tolls for being on their roads and using them. As for workers who became unemployed, they had to depend either on their own savings or on what benefits they might have got to having contributed to trade unions and unemployment benefit, or to the friendly societies, or in the last resort, they depended on charity or went into the workhouses. Likewise, when they became too old to work, they again had on their savings or any pensions they may have paid for in the unions and the friendlies, or again to depend on charity. Now, these arrangements have all been taken over by the government or by local authorities, and the cost has been enormous. I mentioned last time I was speaking here that in 1886 the expenditure of the government in a year was 92 million, and in this current year it is 128,000 million. When you've made allowance for the fact that the prices are now nearly 40 times what they were in 1886, the cost of government has multiplied 35 times compared with what it was 100 years ago. And the reason is that the government's taken over all these functions: health, education, unemployment pay, old age pensions, and so on. When any of you have tried to examine the arguments about nationalisation, the kind of arguments the Labour Party would put up in favour of nationalisation, or the others would put up against nationalisation, you may find it full of confusion. And the confusion is that while governments may act quite rationally and nationalise an industry for a real solid sort of purpose, in the political field they all talk very loosely. You would get the Labour Party didn't only advocate nationalisation for a particular purpose, but they made a principle of it and said, look, we are totally in favour of all nationalisation. The Tory politicians then retorted and said, look, we're against nationalisation. And of course it's created an enormous amount of confusion. For example, the President Winston Churchill, a Member of Parliament, wrote a letter to the Times not long ago saying that the Tory party was opposed to nationalisation because nationalisation is socialism. Well, he'd forgotten the activities of his grandfather, Sir Winston Churchill, who was a very active nationaliser and carried on campaigns for nationalisation often. It was, for example, a Tory government which in 1844, and I emphasise 1844, not 1946, passed the first act giving the government power to nationalise the railways. It was what is called a permissive act, and I'll deal later with the reasons why the Tory government should have passed it at that time. Then you have Churchill and Lloyd George, just after the First World War, carried on a campaign for nationalising the railways. Their idea was to run the railways at cost as a sort of subsidy for British manufacturers and exporters. And it was Sir Winston Churchill who, a few years later, in 1943, gave a radio broadcast, this was in the middle of the war, in which he said there is a broadening field for state ownership and enterprise, obviously intending, had the Tory government won the election in 1945, that the Tory government would itself have gone in for some nationalisation, probably coal mines, and I'll come back to that later. And it was another leading Tory politician, Lord Beaverbrook, who in his Express newspapers for years carried on a campaign for nationalising the Bank of England, which eventually the Labour Party did in 1945. And it was Lloyd George, the Liberal, who, when he was Prime Minister after the First World War, made the statement that his government had decided to nationalise the coal mines. not long afterwards the Tories chucked him out, and they never did in fact carry through that promise by Lloyd George. Now, I've said the Labour Party has made a principle of it. They say we're in favour of nationalisation anyway. But if you look at Labour Party statements, you find they are equally confusing. For example, it was Philip Snowden, who later became Chancellor of the Exchequer in a Labour government, who defended the Labour Party's advocating nationalisation on the ground. He said, we're not doing anything more than the Liberal Party would find acceptable. And it was, although the Labour Party claimed that the nationalised post office was a form of socialism, the man who became first Prime Minister in the Labour government, Clement Attlee, who had himself been Postmaster General, wrote an article in a magazine in 1931 describing the post office, and I quote, as the outstanding example of collective capitalism. And it was another minister in a Labour government, Lee Smith, who said that the Port of London Authority was the latest development in socialist theory. Herbert Morrison, later deputy leader of the Labour Party, agreed with Lee Smith. And it was Herbert Morrison who in 1929 introduced a bill nationalising London passenger transport service. The Labour government was thrown out of office before they'd finished it, and the Tories finished it. The Labour government started it, the Tories finished it. But the interesting thing about that, it was Morrison who, a few years earlier, writing about this same Port of London Authority, which he accepted as the model for the London Passenger Transport Board, described it as, and I quote, a sort of capitalist Soviet, and thoroughly objectionable from a Labour point of view. Just to finish this round of muddled statement, it's worthwhile bringing into the picture Lenin, the leader of the Russian Communist Party. Bismarck, in Germany in the 1870s, was responsible for nationalising a lot of German industries, partly for military reasons, and one of them was the post office. And Karl Marx's colleague, Friedrich Engels, writing about it, said it was deplorable that misguided German social democrats should have welcomed what Engels described as a sort of spurious socialism. Engels said, if nationalisation is socialism, then we ought to say that the founders of the socialist movement were Napoleon and Metternich. And he threw in a crack. He said, are we to suppose that the Prussian government state brothels are socialism too? That was his answer to them. But now look what Lenin said. Lenin, writing about it in his State and Revolution, made this rubbishy statement, and I quote, a witty social democrat of the 70s of the last century called the postal services an example of the socialist economic system. This is very true, says Lenin. This was Bismarck's post office. And of course Engels had already answered it. So you see, they've all created a lot of confusion as to what exactly they mean by nationalisation, even when they either advocate it or oppose it. They've all got themselves into a shocking muddle. The Tories are now set on a course of denationalising the nationalised industries. The Labour Party still wants more nationalisation, but they've watered it down and given it a new name. They now call it social ownership. And the Liberal Social Democratic Party alliance, so far as I can discover, are still sitting on the fence as they were at the last election. They say, look, we don't want any more nationalisation, but we also don't want to denationalise anything. So for the time being, the Liberals SDP alliance can't really be held responsible for anything. But now, to get it all into perspective, look at the record of the parties. The postal service was nationalised in the 18th century and continued all through the 19th century and up to this century by both Liberal and Tory governments. The Post Office Savings Bank was started by the Liberals in 1841. I've already mentioned the Railway Nationalisation Act of 1844 by a Tory government. The telegraphs were nationalised in 1868 and 1869. The Tory government started it, the Liberal government finished it. In 1871, a Liberal government gave the government power to take over the railways in time of war. In 1889, the Tories nationalised the cross-channel cables and added them to the post office. The telephones were nationalised between 1880 and 1912. The Tories made the first move, the Liberals carried it on, and they both accepted, they're both responsible for it. Port of London Authority 1908, a Liberal government. Central Electricity Board 1926, Tory government, Mr Baldwin. The next year the BBC, and again the Tory government, Baldwin. London Passenger Transport Board, Labour started it, Tories finished it. British Overseas Airways Corporation 1939, the Tory government, that was Chamberlain. And coming right up to date, when Rolls-Royce went bust in 1974, the Tory Prime Minister, with Prime Minister Heath, the Tory government nationalised the aero engine section of the former Rolls-Royce company. In view of this record, you can understand what Herbert Morrison meant when, in 1944, in the course of a speech to some schoolboys, he was telling them all about the nationalisation. He said this, he told them, more socialism was done by the Conservative Party, which opposed it, than by the Labour Party, which was in favour of it. But of course, translated this into truthful English, more state capitalism was done by the Conservative Party, which advocated it when they wanted it, and later on were going to change their minds about it, than by the Labour Party, which was in favour of it. Well, that last bit is true. The Labour Party were always, so to speak, in principle, in favour of this. I shall explain later on why the Tories and Liberals were in favour of nationalisation at that time, and why they've changed their minds. But just a word about privatisation. It's a rather hideous word, but people know what it means. This privatisation by the Thatcher government isn't the first. In 1928, the Post Office beam wireless telegraph service, which they had rented from Marconi's, was so successful, it was so much cheaper, that it was undercutting the private cable companies and driving them out of business. And to save the cable companies from bankruptcy, the Tory government denationalised the beam telegraph service. In other words, they handed it over from the post office to a private company, the Cable and Wireless Merger, for the purpose of saving the cable companies from being driven out of business. And after the Labour government nationalised iron and steel in 1946, the next Tory government denationalised it, and then when the Labour Party came back in 1965, they nationalised again. So you've had some denationalising as well as nationalisation has gone on before. Back in the 1930s, a rather rash Assistant Postmaster General, a Tory, made a speech in which he advocated that the telephone service should either be put under a board or, alternatively, that it should be denationalised and handed over to a private company. Nothing was done about it. They set up a committee of inquiry which recommended various things, but they recommended against doing that. It's also interesting to notice this. Naturally, reading English papers, you may get the impression that privatisation is a peculiarly English custom, but it isn't that at all. When the Mitterrand government came in France, they nationalised a lot of banks and insurance company. They were defeated, not the president, but the government was changed. They got a Tory government in, and the present Tory government in France is now denationalising the banks and insurance companies that were nationalised a few years earlier. In Austria, the government has told the nationalised industries that if they don't stop making big losses, they will be denationalised. In Japan, the postal service has already been denationalised, handed over to a private company, and they are now in process of denationalising the Japanese state railways. The Turkish government is privatising the nationalised banks in Turkey. In Portugal, in 1975, they nationalised more than half Portuguese industry. The government now wants to denationalise it, but finds that there's an obstacle in the Portuguese constitution, and they're now busily engaged in altering the constitution so that they can denationalise them again. And in Germany, the German government's policy is to denationalise some state industries in Germany, but so far they've made no progress because they met with opposition inside their own party and in the nationalised industries themselves. there is also America. In America, in 1975, half a dozen company railways went bust, and the government had to step in and take them over to keep the railways running. They're now trying to sell them back, but so far have been unable to get anybody to offer them the price that they think acceptable, but presumably they will continue with this, and they will eventually denationalise these railways. In all of the cases I've mentioned, all these countries, the reason has been the same, either an allegation of inefficiency or that they're making big financial losses. And just the last postscript to this, British Telecom, having been denationalised itself, has set up a department whose job is to go around the world to make a little money by offering to advise other governments how they can denationalise their telephone services, for which, of course, British Telecom will want to be paid. One of the reasons why the nationalisation picture is so confused is that the purposes for which governments have nationalised industries have varied from country to country and from time to time, partly due to different countries having reached different levels of industry and finance. Take the railways, for example. In this country, early in the 19th century, all the factors were present for railways to be set up by companies with the certainty that they would make profit. In other words, the traffic was there, the traffic was already being carried on the roads, by wheeled traffic on the roads and on the canals, but the railways could do it cheaper. And also there was abundant capital looking for investment in Britain. So there was no reason at all why the government had to step in. The companies stepped in, they set up the railways, they were enormously profitable, they drove canals and the road transport people out of business, but I mean that's the way things go. But in America and some continental countries, the situation was different. The traffic didn't exist. For example, in America, particularly owing to the enormous distances to be carried, the traffic for the railways to carry was not already in existence, and the capital wasn't there to develop companies to do it. What had to happen, the government had to step in, or the state governments in America had to step in, provide the finance, build the railways, and then the fact that the railways were built would then build up traffic for the railways to become profitable. But after a big financial collapse in 1837, the law was altered so that the state governments in America could no longer provide finance for the railways. But in the beginning, the government had to do it. Later on, when the traffic had already begun to develop and plenty of capital was available, the American railways were set up by private companies. Another factor which is everywhere present to some degree about building roads and railways was the military question. In France and Germany and other continental countries, which were land powers, the military factor was foremost in the building of roads and railways, not only the building of them, but deciding where they were going to be built. In other words, Germany wanted railways built where they would be available for the invasion of France or Russia, for example. They couldn't just leave it to companies to build railways where they were profitable. So in France and Germany, the governments took over the roads and railways from the first. In Britain, a sea power, the military factor was in roads and railways was less important. So for a time, as I already mentioned, the trunk roads in this country were being built by the turnpike trust companies for profit. Later on, it was decided that they were not developing fast enough, and the government handed over the building of trunk roads in this country to the county councils. If you take the telegraph service, it was developed in Britain by private companies, again because the traffic was there and there's plenty of capital available to invest in them. But in France, the first telegraphs were built by the army for the use of the army, and the public weren't even allowed to use them for years before they would let the public use the French army telegraph service. And also in later years, a lot of industrially backward countries, for the same sort of reasons, lack of capital and lack of development, have had to step in to build basic industries. Their steel industry, their coal industry have had to be done by the governments because capital wasn't available and they couldn't at that time leave it to private companies. In some of these cases, Turkey is one of them, the government stepped in and set up these various industries, and at a later stage the government stepped out and handed them over to private companies, or the private companies to carry on. I now want to look a bit more closely at nationalisation in this country. Taking first the non-commercial nationalised services, the one I've mentioned, education, health, unemployment and old age pensions, the government took over elementary education because industry and commerce were saying to the government, look, it's not good enough for us to have apprentices who learn the techniques of the industries. We want people with a general education in order that British industry can develop. And they looked to Germany. Germany had done it already, and Germany was making rapid industrial strides, overtaking and eventually passing British industry. And as I say, the capitalists here said to the government, look, you can't any longer rely on people having to pay for their education or going to the church charity schools, so they nationalised education in the 1970s. In other words, the government took it over entirely. As I say, in Germany they had already done it, and the British government was partly, at least the people who were advocating this, looked to Germany and said, look what Germany's done, we need to do the same. As regards the health service, it was a similar sort of story. The Germans were in first with this sort of thing, and both in the First World War and in the Second World War, the authorities here were appalled to discover the low physical condition of the millions of people they called up under conscription for the army. As regards unemployment, this also was borrowed from Germany. Germany was first in state schemes to provide doles for the unemployed workers. And of course it had the great advantage, and this is one of the reasons behind it, that once the government provided unemployment pay, they have put an end to these incessant unemployed riots and marches. I mean, you look round, how many of these have taken place now? Hardly any. I mean, the unemployed, so to speak, have been bought off by this government provision of unemployment pay for the unemployed. Another reason, of course, is that when the workers got the vote, in the 1860s and 80s, the Liberal and Tory party now had to compete for workers' votes, and of course it had to be right at the forefront of their campaigning to say eventually, look, we're going to set up an unemployment scheme, which of course they did, a very comprehensive one, when the Labour government came in 1945. Same with regard to old age pensions for people who were too old to work. In 1911, Lloyd George started it, and he reckoned at the time that it would be cheaper to pay people, I think the amount was 10 shillings a week, it would be cheaper to pay the people at age 70, 10 shillings a week, rather than have them going into workhouses where they cost a great deal more. A last point on this, although the so-called welfare state combining health service, sick pay, unemployment pay and the rest of it were introduced by a Labour government in the 1945 Labour government, all of these things had been agreed during the war by the coalition government of Tories, Labour and Liberals. They had all agreed to it and were all more or less committed to the same sort of things. Had the Tories or the Liberals, or a mixture of them, won the 1945 election, which of course they didn't. When we come to the commercial nationalisation, the postal and telephone services, coal, steel and so on, the considerations were different. The problem there was the problem of monopolies. Now, Karl Marx pointed out long ago that there is a natural tendency for capitalist industries to go in for monopoly, in other words, to get together, for two reasons. One, that with the development of machinery, the amount of capital required to run an industry becomes ever greater and greater, and so they need to get together to provide the amount of capital. Also, if they could if you could get the capitalists in a particular industry getting together with a monopoly, they could then charge what prices they liked and make super profits. That, of course, is what each individual group of capitalists would like to do. But if any of them succeed in doing it, the rest of the capitalists are, of course, up in arms about it. The rest of the capitalists do not want to pay through the nose in order to be able to use some monopoly service. And they, therefore, are strongly urging the government all the time to deal with monopolies. Well, there are two possible solutions to a problem of monopoly. One is that you break the monopoly up, which is a system the Americans have more or less consistently used. The other thing is to nationalize it, put it under government control, where the government can, though it is a monopoly, the government can keep the charges low and maintain certain standards of efficiency and provision of national service and so on. Well, in the 19th century, the Liberal and Tory governments favoured the nationalisation solution. As I've said, in America, they after a lot of attempts and giving it up and trying again and so on, American governments have favoured the antitrust solution, and you will all of you read 2 or 3 years ago, following a decision in the American Supreme Court, the American government broke up what was the biggest and richest corporation in the world, the American Telephone and Telegraph Corporation, which had got a monopoly of the American telephone service. That is the line the Americans have taken. Well, what's happened now, having had experience of nationalisation and finding that a lot of conditions have changed, the Thatcher government has decided to change its line. They still want to deal with monopoly, but they have decided that there's no use trying to deal with it through nationalisation of industries, so they have turned to the American system. In other words, the Tory government have strengthened the anti-monopoly laws and are hoping to deal with the thing in that particular way. It has an interesting sideline on this. You will all of you know that Thatcher frequently makes speeches saying that she's in favour of small companies. She wants small capitalists to thrive and or get going and try to make a do of it. Well, oddly enough, in 1921, it was the deputy leader of the Labour Party, Clines, who wrote this. He said the Labour Party prefers a large number of small capitalists to a small number of large capitalists. In other words, Mrs. Thatcher, I don't suppose she did, she could have picked this up from the Labour Party of 60 years ago. But now you can see why the Tory and Liberal governments were in favour of nationalisation in the 19th century. And apart from the postal, telegraph and telephone services, I've mentioned that in 1844 a Tory government passed an act giving them power to take over the railways. Well, what had happened, the railways had got a monopoly of transport. They'd driven the canals out of business and the horse-driven vehicles on the roads. They could charge what they liked. They charged high prices. And they did something else that a lot of the capitalists found particularly infuriating. They would reach an agreement with a favoured customer, and they would let a particular customer use the railways at a lower cost than his rivals. Well, for all these reasons, they got together and pressed the government, and the government passed this act, which was saying to the railways, look, either you mend your ways or we shall take you over. Another interesting thing about this, it was a Tory government, but the minister who carried it through was Gladstone, who was at the Board of Trade. Gladstone started life as a Tory minister, changed over and became leader of the Liberal Party. His rival, Disraeli, started as a Liberal, changed over and became leader of the Tory Party, and it is an old English custom, as you recall, that Sir Winston Churchill started as a Tory, became an independent, then a Liberal, and ended up as leader of the Tory Party. These professional politicians carry on in this particular way. And of course, I've already mentioned that in 1921, Lloyd George and Churchill were advocating nationalisation of the railways for the reason I gave, to run them at cost as a form of subsidising British production and British exports. As regards telegraphs and telephones, both of them were nationalised on the demand of business people, chambers of commerce and so on. And what they had against first the telegraph and then the telephone companies was this. Telegraph companies, there were a number of them, were in business to make profit. They would therefore set up their telegraph offices and their telegraph lines in the places where there was a lot of traffic, around the stock exchange, for example, and in Fleet Street for the newspapers. And later on, the telephone companies did the same. They would concentrate on the towns. No telephone or telegraph company wanted to build lines out into the rural wilderness or the lonelier parts of Scotland and so on. So the business people got together and they said, we want a national service, and we want the thing to be spread into rural areas as well as the rest. And it was for these reasons that capitalist pressure was behind the government in nationalising the telegraphs in 1868 and the telephones later on. One interesting thing about this was when the telegraphs came first, and the law gave the post office a monopoly of the telegraph service. When the telephones came on, the post office took a case to court and got a high court to hold that for the purpose of the act, a telephone is a telegraph, which of course the companies opposed. It was one of these cases where the courts can use a bit of common sense and say, look, we want to cut out a lot of wasted time. Let's say that the telephone is a telegraph, and then the government post office will automatically have a monopoly of the telephone service. But of course, the other thing behind the telegraphs and the telephones was this. First, the telegraph companies were merging together and approaching a monopoly, and later on, the telephone companies were merging together and approaching a monopoly in the national telephone service. So they had this reason that they did not want the telegraphs or the telephones to have a monopoly. And so, like the other things that the Tory and Liberal governments did, this fight against monopoly, they all fall into line. This was the thread that ran through the 19th century. But now we come with conditions different, and the Thatcher government has decided that that no longer works, and the way to do it is to use the American antitrust system, which has been the example of which has been followed in this country. Of course, in the meantime, with long years of nationalisation is not the vote winner that it used to be. There's no doubt whatever that in 1945, when the Labour Party said we're going to nationalise a whole lot of industries, it was a vote catcher for them and enabled them to win the election. But people have had a lot of experience now, and I don't think many people look at it like that. And I'll put this to you. In 1920, Sir Leo Chiozza-Money, an economist who had been a prominent member of the Liberal Party and joined the Labour Party, wrote a book about nationalisation, which was full of examples of nationalisation all over the world, and the claim that they were all making profit and so on. Well, in latter days, of course, the outstanding feature of nationalised services, not only here but a lot of other parts of the world, they don't make profits, they make losses. And I put this to you: would anybody dream now of publishing a book with the title that Sir Leo Chiozza-Money gave to it? He called it The Triumph of Nationalisation. Well, I don't think a publisher who got out a book like that now would sell many copies. But behind the Labour Party's enthusiasm for nationalisation was a very interesting economic theory that people have paid too little attention to it. Karl Marx pointed out that rent of land, industrial profits, and interest on borrowed money are all of them part of surplus value that the capitalist gets by the exploitation of the workers. That it's just surplus value is the lot. It is divided in practice into industrial profits, rent of land, and interest on capital. In other words, if you have a factory owner who doesn't own the land and has to borrow money, he doesn't pocket all the profits he makes. He has to hand over his share to the people from whom he's borrowed money, maybe the banks or somebody else, and to the landlord if he's rented land. But they're all the same sort of things. They're parts of the exploitation of the workers. Now, the early Fabian society, though they were not Marxist, accepted this. They said, no difference, rent, interest and profit, all the same sorts of things. But later on, Professor Tawney, in a book called The Acquisitive Society, produced a new theory. He said that rent of land and industrial profits are quite different from interest. He said that interest on borrowed money is a natural and necessary feature of all forms of society, whether capitalist or socialist. And J.R. MacDonald, the leader of the Labour Party, who was their first Prime Minister, took over this theory from Tawney. Tawney had a lot of influence in the Labour Party anyway. He accepted Tawney's theory. Here is a quotation from MacDonald's book, Socialism, Critical and Constructive, published in 1929. And I quote, "When labour uses capital and pays it its market value, property is defensible." Now you see, if you take the view that rent, interest and profit are all the same, they're all exploitation, property isn't defensible. I mean, nobody can put up a defence for it. Here's Tawney and MacDonald saying property is defensible if labour uses capital and pays it its market value. MacDonald was also a leading member of the Independent Labour Party, which was affiliated to and supported the Labour Party. And here's a quotation from an Independent Labour Party pamphlet called How Socialists Would Run Industry. This was published in 1924 when there was a Labour government. "Why should not labour hire capital and devote the whole of the surplus to the improvement of the service?" And another Independent Labour Party called Socialism in the Villages said this: "There is every reason to expect that agriculture will yield a far better return to labour and capital than it now does." In other words, you've got the Labour Party rejecting entirely Marx's view about exploitation, and incidentally rejecting the Fabian Society's view of it, coming over to the Tawney view and making this queer distinction between one form of property income and another. The one thing that MacDonald and Tawney and Labour Party consistently have always said is, you hire, to use their phrases, you hire capital to run a nationalised industry, but the people who are lending you the money must in no circumstances whatever have any hand in the running of the industry, and this they have been quite consistent about it. And with one small temporary exception, there never have been any shareholders in nationalised industries who could sit on the board, have votes, play any part whatever in the running of the industry. The only small temporary exception was that London Passenger Transport Board, where one of the class of shareholders had not a fixed rate of return, but a variable one depending on the profits in the London Passenger Transport Board. And the lawyers got busy on this and said, well, if the interest they're going to receive on the money they put into London Passenger Transport Board is going to depend on profit, they've got to have some form of hold over it. And so they got written into the London Passenger Transport Board a provision for them, if necessary, if they didn't get their money, to go to the courts and get London Passenger Transport Board, as it were, declared bankrupt. And there's never been any such provision in the other industries, so to speak. Once you've got a nationalised industry, there's no existing provision, as it were, for getting rid of them, merely because they make big losses. But you see what all this means. When the Labour Party nationalised the mines, the railways and so on, when they paid £1,000 million to the ex-railway shareholders, the shareholders were then right out of the business. They had no further part in whatever. They were in no way dependent on them, and it didn't matter to them, once they'd got out, whether the coal board, the railways, anybody else made a profit or a loss. They were out, they got their money, it was absolutely guaranteed, because the bonds they received weren't charges on the coal mines or on the railways, they were charges on the Treasury as part of the budget. So you see what this means. Of course, I just want to make the point perfectly clear. If the whole of the coal mines went out of existence, the former shareholders in the coal companies would still go on getting their money. And if all the railways were wound up, the ex-railway shareholders would still go on getting their money. And as I say in this, the Labour Party have been consistent. They've always said, you know, we'll compensate them, but we won't let them play any part in the industry once they've got out. Coming back to this Labour Party, independent Labour Party concept of hiring capital and paying interest to the lenders, they thought it would work like this. They said the land would be nationalised, so all the rents would come to the government. The owners of the nationalised industries would no longer receive profits. They'd be compensated in getting out, so all the profits would come to the government. And the only charge the government would have in the nationalised industries would be paying interest to the people from whom they had borrowed money. Now that looks beautiful on paper, and as they saw it on paper, they thought, look, there's going to be enormous surplus coming into the hands of the government for the government to do what it liked with. They said, look, you know, we should have an enormous amount of money. We've only got one charge on it. We're going to get the profits. We're going to get the rent. We only have to pay the interest, and we should have a lot of money left over. And they said this big surplus fund should be used to improve the service, to lower the charges, and to raise the wages of the workers. That, of course, was their dreamland. But now look at what actually happened in practice. They had made the assumption that capitalist companies always make profits. They forgot all about the times, of course, when capitalist companies make losses and go bankrupt. They didn't think that depressions would ever happen again when they had accepted the old Keynesian rubbish. They thought that there was not going to be any more unemployment, no more depressions, so they ruled out the possibility that a nationalised industry could run into depression. So they were quite certain, you see, that they were going to have plenty of money to spare and we'd be able to do all these things, raise the wages of the workers, improve the service and reduce the charges. Lloyd's Bank, 3 or 4 years ago, tabulated all the financial returns of all the nationalised industries for the 17 years from 1961 to 1977. Now, I've told you what the dream of the Labour Party was when they nationalised. I now read out to you the reality. I quote, "The table shows that the financial surpluses of the public corporations have at no point been sufficient to cover the interest costs on their accumulating debt in addition to wages and salaries. They have therefore had to borrow growing sums to pay the interest that they could not cover from their sales revenues." In other words, instead of the government having an enormous income coming into it and only having to pay out a little interest, it's had to borrow money actually even to pay the interest, because most of the nationalised industries have run into great financial difficulties. And as I just say, that was up to 1977. In one later year, 1980, the total subsidy of the government to the nationalised industries for 1 year was £1,800 million. And as I've already explained, the only people who never had to worry about it are the former shareholders, because they were getting their money. It didn't matter to them whether the nationalised industries were profitable or not. There have been changes in the form of nationalisation. When the postal, telegraph and telephone services were nationalised, they were government departments. The staff were civil servants. They were under very, very rigid treasury control. There were treasury people, so to speak, sitting in the post office watching every penny they spent. I remember on one occasion a post office official saying to me that he couldn't spend more than £5, as it were, without getting treasury permission to do it. Slight exaggeration, but that was the sort of thing that it was. And they had a political head, the Postmaster General. Now, you often get people saying, look, why, when the government appoints a minister in charge of a department, don't they charge a man who knows all about it? I mean, why don't they put a teacher in charge of education, and a railwayman in charge of railways, and a coal miner in charge of coal mines? They don't understand the Constitution. The job of the political minister, apart from telling the departments what they've got to do and carrying their views back to the government, the job of every minister is to prevent the government from spending too much money. That's what they're there for. So it is a fact and the Post Office is no exception. There has never been a Postmaster General appointed from within the Post Office. The Postmaster General was appointed there to carry on the Treasury work of keeping down Post Office expenditure, because the Post Office surplus, as one of the revenue departments, went to the Chancellor of the Exchequer as part of his budget revenue, along with the other revenue departments, Inland Revenue and Customs and Excise. But being a government department meant that every detail of Post Office expenditure had to come before Parliament. Several times a year and continuously, every detail of Post Office estimates had to go before Parliament, where every MP could, they'd get opportunity of debating it. They could look at everything, every item of expenditure, including, of course, every item of expenditure on wages, and the wages of all the, I don't know, something like 100 different Post Office departments. MPs would try to burrow into these and express views about them. Then in 1930s, when the Labour Party were getting ready to come into office again and carry on a lot of nationalisation, Herbert Morrison and others pointed out to them that they could no longer run nationalised industries as government departments, because if they did, the whole of Parliament's time, all the year round, would be taken up with discussing wages and all the other things in nationalised industries. So he said, you've got to get it away from Parliament. So they invented this board system where the government appoints a board, the government provides the finance, the board is supposed to have day-to-day responsibility for running the particular department. But in all the nationalisation acts setting up these public boards, they're all of them required to pay their way, in other words, to make a profit. And the practice has existed in recent years, both Labour and Tory governments, of saying to the Post Office and the other nationalised industries that there is a certain target of profit they expect them to yield based on the average yield on capital in private industry. Now, because the nationalised industries are now not exactly popular, the Labour Party has decided to invent a new form and give it this new name, social ownership. And they've announced the details of it at present with regard to British Telecom, which has been privatised and has got shareholders in the British Telecommunications Company, including a lot of the staff. The Labour Party are going to revert to a form of nationalisation, and what they've said to the people who are now shareholders, we shall take away your shares, but we'll give you in return an interest-bearing security, but it will not give you any say whatever in the running of the company. Some difficulties have arisen in the past and are going to arise in the future about the nationalised industries. And they've never been solved. They concern the relationship between the public boards and the government and Parliament. I've said that in theory the boards are supposed to have sole responsibility for day-to-day operations, but all the boards, whether under Labour governments or Tories, have complained bitterly that they're continually being chased and harassed by ministers trying to interfere with the day-to-day operations, including their charges and the wages they pay and all the rest of it. And the MPs complain that whereas under the old Post Office form they could always raise questions in the House of Commons about Post Office because it was a government department, they haven't got this facility with regard to the nationalised industries. All the nationalised industry boards want to have financial autonomy to do what they like about raising money and so on, but I don't think that any government is ever going to let them have it. They've never let them have it in the past, and I can't see them doing it now. We now come to the question we put at the beginning, that when the Tories would say privatisation is good and the Labour Party would say privatisation is bad, and the question arises for us, how does it affect the working class? Look at what the Labour Party claimed when they went in for nationalisation. They said that the nationalised industry would be more efficient and more profitable. Absolutely nothing in this. I mean, a nationalised industry can be efficient, as the Post Office used to be, It can be profitable, as the post office used to be, or it can be very inefficient or very unprofitable, as some of the later ones have been. Just like any private company, there is simply nothing in this. The Labour Party said that the nationalised industries would pay higher wages to the workers they employed. Right in the early days, when the Fabian Society launched this, but wrote it in terms of municipalisation, of local authorities taking over industries, they actually had a very funny passage written by Bernard Shaw. He said, look, as soon as local authorities take over industries, they'll put up wages. But he said, well, they mustn't put up wages too much and too fast, because if they put them up immediately, all the workers employed by private companies will come on the doorstep of the local authorities wanting municipal jobs. So they have to do it very gradually. Well, if you can think back to the Winter of Discontent, for example, 1978-9, when the Callaghan Labour government was trying to keep pay increases down to 5%, when prices were going up by 10%, the people who were striking against him were 1 million or more local authority workers. In other words, Bernard Shaw's dream of the local authorities paying more than everybody else just didn't work. In the ups and downs of wages, it can happen from time to time that people in nationalised industries or in the civil service get more than people outside. Other times they get less. It's just the way the thing goes. And it can happen both ways. In the 1920s, for example, the government set up special economy committees to look into the fact that, as they said, certain industries, including civil service and post office, had got rates of pay above those in outside industry which had fallen. Whereas in the last 2 or 3 years, it's been the teachers, the health service workers, and the civil servants are all complaining that they're getting paid less than their opposite numbers in private industry. The thing can happen both ways. In the post office, right at the beginning, the head postmaster in every district used to recruit some grades like postmen at whatever he could get them to accept according to local rates of pay. Later on, they set up a system by which Parliament would appoint a select committee which would take a thorough look into every detail of post office pay and make recommendations accordingly. Later on again, they came into line with the Civil Service Arbitration Tribunal, and the very elaborate system of pay comparisons that was set up in 1955 and which has now been suspended. But in all these systems, you see, the key factor all the time about the pay of people in the nationalised industries is what people are getting in private companies. I mean, at all these things, the thing would be argued backwards and forwards. Both sides would put in information about it. The other thing, and this particularly appealed to the trade unions, the other thing the Labour Party promised about nationalisation was that it would give people job security. Well, how wrong they were. There have been hundreds of thousands of railwaymen and steel workers lost their jobs in the last 10 years, about 500,000 miners, including, by the way, the 1965 Labour government with its national plan planned to get rid of 179,000 miners. The reason being that the mines were being run at a loss. And it actually says in the plan, we are closing down loss-making pits as quickly as possible. I mean, this is something, of course, that has got to be, if nationalised industries are to be run at a profit, and if the demand changes and they're going out of business, just like any private company, they can't give job security. In the last 2 months, there have been 3 reports in newspapers about coal mines being closed down and miners losing their jobs. The first was in this country. Our nationalised industry announced last week they're closing down some mines in Scotland, and they reckon that 10,000 miners' jobs will disappear. My second example is from Japan, where the mines are privately run. They're closing down loss-making pits in Japan, and 14,000 miners are losing their jobs in Japan. My third example is from Hungary, where, of course, the mines are nationalised, and capitalism in Hungary is run by a self-styled communist government. They're closing down pits, and the miners have been told they've got to work longer hours in order to make the mines profitable. In all 3 cases, of course, it's exactly the same, that the mines are losing money. Just a glance in the 19th century, the post office always had a queue of people wanting to get jobs in the post office. And it wasn't so much the pay wasn't particularly attractive, but it was because they did have a job for life, they had quite generous sick pay, and they had a non-contributory pension scheme. In later years, of course, other industries have acquired these things, and the post office has ceased to be the attraction that it used to be. During the war, the other thing, of course, the Labour Party said was that when all these industries are nationalised, the workers will feel that the industry belongs to them, so they won't come out on strike against it. In 1943, during the war, Winston Churchill made that statement of his about there being a broadening field for state ownership and enterprise, and as I say, I think he probably had in mind the coal mines. A few months later, Harold Lasky, a prominent member of the Labour Party, wrote an article in Lord Beaverbrook's Evening Standard appealing to Churchill to announce the nationalisation of the mines to improve the war effort, to get people to fight more willingly in the war. This is what Lasky wrote. The effect on output, on absenteeism and on strikes would be immediate and important. And 3 years later the Labour Party carried that out with their widespread nationalisation, and you know the result has been. Since all these industries are nationalised, the majority of all strikes are now in nationalised industries, because the workers soon found out that nothing had changed in nationalising the mines and the other industries, except this, that in the mines they were dealing with several hundred mine owners, linked in the Mine Owners Federation. When they were nationalised, they're dealing with only one board. And of course, the outstanding case of all this was the miners. For about 50 years before the mines were nationalised, the miners' unions and the Trade Union Congress carried on a campaign for nationalisation. When the Labour Party came in 1945 and introduced a nationalisation bill, they actually consulted the Miners' Federation, the worker of the union, about what was to be in the bill, and they agreed, and they all voted for it. In 1946, they got the mines nationalised. Well, now just think, 1926, when they were fighting the coal owners, the miners came out on strike for 7 months, were shatteringly defeated by the mine owners and the government. 60 years afterwards, in 1985, the miners again come out on strike. They stay out for a year, and they're shatteringly defeated by the coal board and the government. And this is the coal board they spent 50 years urging the governments to introduce. So to speak, they got they were responsible, but it's hardly what they expected. So what's our case against nationalisation? The Socialist Party of Great Britain never joined in the Labour Party campaign. We never advocated, defended or supported nationalisation. Nationalisation is state capitalism, except that the ownership and control is vested in a government-appointed board instead of a company board of directors. Nothing has changed. The aim is the same, to make profit by the exploitation of the working class. In 1981, the chairman of the Post Office Board, who had been appointed by a Labour government, made a speech in which he said this: "We are proud to make a profit in all our businesses and intend to go on doing so. It is in our customers' best interest that the post office should be commercially motivated and that we should make profits to pay for growth and improvement in our services and repay loans." Now that speech, of course, could be made by managing director of ICI or Sainsbury's to their shareholders' annual meeting. Nothing is any different. Nationalisation is not socialism. It continues the production of commodity for sale at a profit. Socialism, of course, seeks the opposite, involving the abolition of buying and selling. Nothing under socialism would be bought or sold. There would be no production for sale. Production would be solely and directly for use. And that, of course, is what the Socialist Party have been saying ever since it was formed, and we shall continue going on saying it until the workers recognise that by advocating and supporting nationalisation, it has been for the working class 50 appalling wasted years.
Thank you, Comrade Hardy. We'll have a short break for...
The Monopolies Commission that's been set up by the government, how much do you think they're under pressure from time to time on government departments to make a ruling on a so-called monopoly? When you look at the recent rulings that they've given, one regarding the takeover of Allied Lions by the Australian group, which would obviously form a fantastic monopoly in the world of alcoholic drinks. And then on the other hand, they turned down a proposal which on the face of it seems something quite normal and logical for capitalist competition.
Well, I mean, the answer is that obviously they do get pressure from government departments, and I mean from the Prime Minister's department in particular, but they're in some difficulty, and the Americans are in this difficulty, you see. In theory, they would like to break up all monopolies, but the companies concerned say, look, if you break us up, how can we be big enough to compete in world markets? General Electric are using this argument. They say, look, we're a big company, but we're not big enough to compete with the German and the American big electrical concerns. And even the Americans have got the same problem. The American companies, when they're being broken up, say to the American government, well, that's all right for America, but how do we compete in world markets? And so, they've got a difficulty. There is also, I haven't looked at it recently, but there is also, or there was, a difference between British anti-monopoly law and American. In America, the law says that a monopoly is illegal, however they define it, and we break it up. In Britain, it is up to the companies to argue to the Monopolies Commission that their monopoly is in the national interest. In other words, if they can show that they are a monopoly as defined, it doesn't mean they've got complete control of the market, by the way. They've got a formula for defining it. They can say, yes, we've got it, but look at our prices. We don't put out charge monopoly prices. But in answer to the question, I'm sure of it, that the government has a lot of considerations and departments make representations. One thing, of course, is this military thing, and whether they are prepared to let control of certain things go out of the hands of British citizens and go into the hands of foreign citizens and companies. Now, I expect it's all very muddled, and they'll run into continual difficulties all the time they try to do it. But I mean, as far as Thatcher is concerned, she wants to introduce more competition, and of course the people concerned want to keep what they've got. In other words, the companies themselves, a little bit of monopoly or a lot of monopoly is just what they like.
Yeah, just a moment. Yes, there's one. Yes.
I wonder if Comrade Hardy could say why the Labour Party has been opposed to Marxist ideas since the beginning of its history, and also whether we recognise it that say in the last 20 years there seems to be an upsurgence of Marxist elements within the Labour Party.
Well, I mean, you've got the question as to why the Labour Party has been opposed to Marxist ideas. Well, look, what we're dealing with here, the only thing I would say matters is Marxist economics. You have heard of people who say they're Marxists, but they don't accept Marx's labour theory of value or something like that. That is nonsense. Marx said that it was his economics, an essential part of which is his labour theory of value, which is the basis of everything that Marx wrote. So I'm not dealing with what are called the political aspects of Marxism, but on about Marxist economic theory. Back in 1890 or thereabouts, there was a conference called a meeting of English socialists. The Social Democratic Federation was there, the Hammersmith Socialist Society, and the Fabian Society. William Morris drew up a manifesto for them, which was absolutely committed them to socialism as Marx understand it and as we understand it. That is the abolition of buying and selling, the abolition of commodity production altogether, and that distribution shall be on the basis of from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. They all signed it, including Sidney Webb, who later became influential in the Labour Party, and Bernard Shaw, and the Fabian Society as a whole. Now, I think there are two explanations of this. One, there was at that time a lot of interest in Marx's works. There was a real flood of pamphlets coming out and books and copies of the English translation of Marx's Capital. And it was in the air, so to speak. It was in the time of it was in the middle of the Great Depression, and there was a lot of people influenced in Marxist economic theories. They all signed it. Later on, after William Morris died, Bernard Shaw jacked out and said it was all nonsense. He never said so while William Morris was alive, by the way. Morris would have given him a dusty answer on this. But come right forward to when the Labour Party was formed, the first chairman of the Labour Party was Keir Hardie, 1907. And while he was chairman of the Labour Party, Keir Hardie wrote two books. One was called From Serfdom to Socialism, the other was called My Confession of Faith. And in both of these, Keir Hardie laid down absolutely the Marxist case. He claimed that the only purpose of the Labour Party was to introduce socialism based on the Marxist conception of from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. And he specifically claimed that the Labour Party was to be in the Marxist tradition and was the only Marxist organisation in this country. He didn't mention the SPGB, by the way. But I think you can accept it that at that moment, what was in Keir Hardie's mind was this. Keir Hardie had watched the Social Democratic Federation fighting elections and getting handfuls of votes, like the Socialist Party of Great Britain does now, a few hundred or a few dozen votes. And Keir Hardie said, look, it's obvious that you're not going to make headway, rapid headway, while you put the Marxist case before the workers. It's too advanced for them, they don't understand it. And Keir Hardie then developed a theory, which he explains it all. He said, what we want to do is to get the workers together in a trade union-backed Labour Party and win them over to socialism afterwards. Well, with hindsight, we can look at this and say, well, look, it didn't work, but it couldn't work. I mean, it's absurd. But my own view is that at the time Keir Hardie wrote it, he meant it. And incidentally, in writing this, he warned the Labour Party against something. He said that as the trade unions and the Social Democratic Federation and the Fabian Society were making progress, they were being flooded by what he called ambitious intellectuals coming in there to get parliamentary jobs. And he sort of said, look, we don't want them. I mean, so at least he did understand what happened later on when, of course, the Labour Party had been flooded by these people. When the Liberal Party collapsed, all the budding Liberal MPs flocked into the Labour Party and got jobs there. So the answer is, I think, that what members of the SPGB would have said all along, that the only way a socialist idea can be put forward is by a socialist party consisting of nothing but socialists. You go on preaching socialism. But you see, to ambitious politicians, this is no good. They want to get power. And so those who believe it and those who don't believe it will still say that what we've got to do is to get control of the House of Commons, get people in the House of Commons, put our case in the House of Commons and win people over. And I would say what you got is a gradual disappearance of the socialist idea. 1923, the Labour Party, who had not been in office, put down a resolution in the House of Commons, worded for them quite strongly, saying that capitalism was the cause of all the trouble and demanding the abolition of capitalism. Well, you can't imagine them putting it down now. But you see, when you get into office, the thing grows by its own momentum. You're having to deal with day-to-day problems, and you're trying all the time to say to the workers, look, we're solving your problems, and at the end of the road we're going to give you socialism. Well, Keir Hardie, without intending it, answered himself in the From Serfdom to Socialism. He said that there are a lot of evils. There's the housing problem, there's the health problem, there's unemployment, there's poverty. There's also disarmament, and he said the Labour Party is going to tackle the disarmament programme first, 1907. Well, I wouldn't like to guess. I suppose the destructive power of armaments in the world is about 100,000 times what it was in 1907. They've got nowhere. But you see, at the time that he said it, it may have looked quite a reasonable proposition. I think they have just lost it. They've lost contact with it, and they have just become a replacement of the old Liberal Party. 19th century divided up between the Liberals and the Tories. The Liberal Party collapses, helped to collapse by the Labour Party. The Labour Party's taken it over, and it's become the alternative party for running capitalism, and they have forgotten all about it. In the 1930s, when we debated with members of the Labour Party and the ILP, it was quite common for the man to start off by saying, we entirely accept your object of socialism, but we think there's a different and quicker way of getting there. You wouldn't get a Labour Party or a member of the ILP, well, there isn't any ILP now, you wouldn't get any Labour Party saying this now, if in fact you were to put to them that socialism was about the abolition of buying and selling, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. I mean, whereas in the 1930s they would have accepted it.
Yes?
Could I revert to the previous lecture? Well, it is directly connected with the novels. I wonder if H would care. I think most of the people would be interested if you could explain what you already explained to me about the control of prices and Young's brewery and cigarettes and the monopoly in cinema tickets and so on.
Well, I mean, I will.
Would you take some other questions first?
Yes, we'll come back to you later, right? Have we any more questions? Yes?
Just arising out of the last one, the same process was taking place in the Social Democratic Party in Germany, being firm standards, more or less going along the channels of the Labour Party. I mean, they were supposed to be a typically Marxist party.
Well, yes, you've got the same sort of thing in Germany. Marx and Engels was full of admiration for the German Social Democratic Party because they claimed to be Marxists. They had people in there who studied Marxian economics, and on the face of it, they accepted it. And Engels made one curious statement. He said the German workers were much better than the English workers because he said the German workers understand theory and the English workers are just practically minded people and they don't understand theory. But of course when the time came, when the 1914 war came, the German workers behaved exactly the same as the English workers, nothing to choose between them. Later on, after the Second World War, the German Social Democratic formally abandoned its attachment to Marxist theory. And so I think I've read lately the Portuguese party have done. In practice they have all done. And incidentally, Bertrand Russell, who wrote a lot of rubbish during his life, did one useful piece of work. The first thing he did when he came down from university, he went to Germany to study the German Social Democratic Party and its socialism. And in this book of his, he said they're not socialists, they're German patriots. And of course it was perfectly true. But they have all got away from this for the reasons I say. You become a functioning political party, you want office, you want power. And whatever people may believe at the beginning, they're dealing with problems from day to day, and the idea that they should look for a mandate to introduce socialism is just impossible. I mean, it isn't now they don't want to do it, they wouldn't even believe that it's possible. There was an intervening stage. I've mentioned Herbert Morrison, who was deputy leader of the Labour Party. Privately, Herbert Morrison used to say the SPGB is quite right, but he said, you're before your time, the only thing to do now is to do practical works, which he did. And including in his practical works was running a no more war organisation between the wars and saying, you know, we all sign a peace pledge union, we won't fight in any circumstance or whatever. And as you may remember, he became minister in the Second World War, looking after all the bomb business and all the rest of it.
So there's an analogy between the Bolsheviks and the Labour Party historically. So the Bolsheviks, after all, also could be said to be sincere about their aims.
I mean, this is it's always a debatable point, you see. I've mentioned Keir Hardie. I think Keir Hardie meant it when he said it. I've known other members of the SPGB who scoff at the idea and say, you know, it was fake all along. Well, frankly, I don't believe it. And I'm prepared to think, I'm absolutely sure that some of the members of the Russian Communist Party really did believe that they were going to introduce socialism. I mean, they were basically wrong in this sense. They were going to introduce socialism without socialists. In other words, they were going to do it by getting power first and, as it were, imposing socialism on Russia. But I'm quite sure that a lot of the people who were thumped off by the Stalin government were people who wanted to carry on the old idea of socialism. The Russian Communist Party had a textbook, an economic textbook by Bogdanov, And Bogdanov spells out what socialism means. He says it's the highest conceivable form of society. No prices, no wages, no taxes, no profits, no anything. Now, if you were to ask communists in Russia about this now, frankly, I don't know what they'd say. But I suppose they'd invent some reason. Probably deny that Bogdanov ever existed.
Just as an aside there, I was in Russia this year and asked a Russian, did they agree that there was no socialism in Russia, and she answered me yes. And I said, well, when do you think you will have it? And she said 100 years' time.
Yes, when I had that for somebody said we're on the way. So I said it's taken a long time on the way.
Next question? Yes?
Do you think there is, in point, a satisfactory way in which we as a socialist political organisation can actually define these terms left and right that are used constantly, we all know, used day out, day in on the public media, etc., even within the reference of the Tory party? I mean, is there a satisfactory way that we can literally say this is a load of, well, I'll use a familiar old public school term, codswallop, because that's what it is, of course, isn't it?
I'd rather give a satisfactory definition of left and right. I always try to avoid the terms myself. I mean, if somebody insists, I say, will you accept my definition of a left-winger? And they say, yes. Well, I mean, it's some bogus Marxist who is in favour of a capitalist dictatorship which suppresses workers' organisation. I don't think there's any useful purpose served by trying to define the difference. It's the journalists do this. The journalists want to create sensationalism. They want to show at every moment that there's a fight going on inside the Tory party, the Labour party, the Social Democratic. That's what they live on. I mean, like, they live on murders and horrors and all the rest of it, and this left-wing, right-wing business is part of it. I think it's got no meaning whatever. I mean, how would anybody else try to define it?
No, I mean, the reason I asked that is because traditionally, of course, we associate the left with state control. I mean, that's, I would say, certainly in the context of British politics, this would be...
well, that's what I can say.
And of course, the right is with private, so-called private industry.
I don't. I mean, as I say, I try to avoid it. I don't think I used the... Well, I'm sure I didn't use the term left or right-wing during the whole of this hour that I spoke tonight. I wouldn't dream of using it. It's got no meaning, you see. There's no definition you could give to any so-called left-winger or right-winger that would actually fit it. I mean, look, is a left-winger someone who supports nationalisation like Winston Churchill, or someone who opposes it like Mrs. Thatcher? What are they? Was Churchill a left-winger, right-winger, middle of the road, or what? What's Thatcher? Thatcher, of course, is not a Tory at all. She's a 19th century Adam Smith liberal, and she's trying to restore competitive capitalism. Does that make her a right-winger or a left-winger?
Yeah. Anyone? Yes? Is there anyone else? You've had one. Just 1 second. Is there anyone else? All right, you can come back again.
You said earlier on, very Hardy, that Tawny was an ideological influence on the Labour Party. Are there any ideological gurus, if you like, within the Labour Party today, like Tony Thornton, Neil Kinnock? And also, would you recognise that because, for example, feminism has entered within the popular consciousness, and also there are feminists within the Labour Party, that the days of the Labour Party, the bourgeois party, may be numbered?
Sorry, what was that last point?
That because feminism has entered the popular consciousness, and that feminists, there are some feminist actors in the Labour Party, that the days of the Labour Party as a bourgeois party may be numbered.
I mean, because what exactly is meant by a bourgeois party in this connection? The Labour Party...
I meant a party that aligns to the continuation of capitalism.
Well, I mean, all the Labour Party, Tory Party, Liberal Party, SDP... I mean, there's no argument about it now. They're just an alternative government for running capitalism. And when Lord Houghton said in 1967, writing in an article in the Times about his own Labour government, never has any party done so much in so short a time as to make modern capitalism work. I mean, this is what they're doing. Look at the Labour Party programme. You will find nothing in the Labour Party programme now which intentionally harms British capitalism. They may be up the pole, but they're their intention is to help British capitalism, and they will say so. I mean, they'll say it's to help British capitalism to capture markets from foreigners and all the rest of it. But of course, you see, if you started off by saying, is there anybody in the Labour Party now who's taken the place of Tory, who was very influential? Well, of course, the Labour Party, like the Tory Party and the Liberal Party in 1944, all became dedicated Keynesians. It's Keynes, and it's there still. In the 74-79 Labour government, in 1976 under Callaghan, Keynes blew up in their faces. They suddenly found, I mean, I've explained this last time I was here, Keynes said, run a budget deficit to solve the unemployment problem, run a budget surplus to solve the inflation problem. What do you do when unemployment and inflation are both going up at the same time? And you can't run both. And they abandoned Keynes. Callaghan and Dennis Healey said, you know, Keynes is finished. But that's been forgotten, including by Dennis Healey. Dennis Healey will probably deny it now, because the Labour Party's got to try to win the next election, and they've got to put forward the old Keynesian rubbish again. They've got to say, we can solve the unemployment problem. Kill it yesterday. We can reduce unemployment by 1 million in a year. They've decided not to say we can abolish unemployment entirely in 6 months or so. I mean, they're being a bit more cautious. But that's the basic idea in the Labour Party. It's the Keynesian stuff. Take it away, what have they got left? I mean, there's no votes to be won by saying we're now monetarists. Doesn't mean anything. I mean, Thatcher, so to speak, has moved away from this. And about feminism, I'm afraid, I mean, about the basic question, I don't know whether any of you read an article in the Evening Standard this week by the American correspondent, by some backroom boys in America. Some of the people have been studying the brain, and come along now and say that there is a real difference between men's and women's brains in the way they function. And I mean, it's a serious case they put. But by the way, the writer didn't mention, it's not new, there was an English mathematician, daughter of a mathematician, Mary Agnes Boole, wrote a book, I don't know, about half a century ago, called Logic Taught by Love, in which she put the same point of view. She said it's not a question of one being better than the other, but she said, in fact, women's brains do work differently from men's, and I'm not going to express any opinion on it, but I accept this. There are no votes. If the Labour Party decides that there are no votes in feminism, feminism will be on its way out as far as the Labour Party is concerned.
That idea quite similar to the theory of scientific racism, which helped British imperialism to conquer the world.
Or, I mean, the superiority of the white races over the black. Well, of course, with the British, I mean, this was Hitler's thing, fed out to him, as is always the case, by the university professors. No nonsense is so absurd, put forward by a government, that they can't trot out some university professors to back it. I mean, look at all the alleged economists who've poured out of British universities in the last 40 years. All of them, 90% of them all, advocating the old Keynesian rubbish, until they found that it wasn't any work, and then they moved over to monetarism, and they're not economists, they don't know anything about it. And the same thing can happen, of course, with the university people in all fields. But about this basic question, as I say, if it gets them into power, they will follow it out. And it isn't the only racial one. There was a time, somebody here may remember the name of the man who fed it, where there was a lot of propaganda went on in Europe, Germany and this country and in America, that the world was going to be overrun by the yellow races, as they called them. He took it over. There was somebody before Houston Chamberlain, yes. And this had a long run, and it had political usefulness to political parties, and they'll do it. As I say, there is nothing that they can't invent to get some publicity out of. And whatever nonsense it is, they'll always get some university professors to trot out and prove it or disprove it.
Next question? Yes?
Next question,
My interest, Mr. Harvey, over the last 30 years, the Indian government has pursued a very wide program of nationalisation. And at the same time, quite unique, they run their own unit trusts and sell the shares in it.
I didn't know that.
Yes.
About trade, quite by accident, I came across something that intrigued me the other day. All the economists and all the politicians talk about a favourable balance of trade. If you export more than you import, they say that's a favourable balance of trade. Well, I came across the first programme of the Indian National Congress, Mrs. Gandhi's people, when they were formed in 1885. They wanted to make a case against the British. Well, at that time, there was a very favourable balance of trade in India. They were exporting ever so much more than they were importing. Well, the Indian nationalists couldn't stand this for a moment. So they obviously got some Saatchi and Saatchi at the time to think up an answer to it. And the answer to it they found was this. They said, instead of saying, look, good old British, they've got us a favourable balance of trade, they said the British are taking out X quantity out of India and only bringing in half X. They're bleeding India to death. And of course it was a political winner.
If there are no more questions, we'll have discussion. Any more questions?
Yeah, well, no, it's not quite a question. I was just wonder whether Comrade Harvey's got any sort of idea or statistical evidence. Read post offices in the employment bureaus. I didn't realise that the general post offices in each town, did not necessarily belong to the post office. In actual fact, the pay register land.
Balance of trade in India, they were exporting ever so much more than they were importing. Well, the Indian nationalists couldn't stand this for a moment. So they obviously got some Saatchi and Saatchi at the time to think up an answer to it. And the answer to it they found was this. They said, instead of saying, look, good old British, they've got us a favourable balance of trade, they said the British are taking out X quantity out of India and only bringing in half X. They're bleeding India to death. And of course it was a political winner.
If there are no more questions, we'll have discussion. Any more questions?
Yeah, well, no, it's not quite a question. I was just wonder whether Comrade Harvey's got any sort of idea or statistical evidence. Read post offices in the employment bureaus. I didn't realise that the general post offices in each town, did not necessarily belong to the post office. In actual fact, the pay register landlords from these places.
Well, the post office always had three systems. There have been head postmasters. Matter of fact, earlier they had a still bigger thing. They had a surveyor over a very big area, and then 2 or 3 head postmasters inside the surveyor's area, then postmasters under him, and alongside the postmasters there were what were called sub-office postmasters, the grocers' shops and people like this, who are not post office employees. They are contract employees, and they do work, as it were. They're paid. I mean, for however many stamps they sell, they're paid on a unit basis, and how many postal orders, and how many telephone calls, and things like this. But they're not part of. They're not part of the post office. They're contractors, subcontractors.
So what I was getting at is that the landlord capitalist class, some of them must be getting a good deal at letting out their premises to the big departments.
Well, see, most of these sub-post offices have a pretty miserable living out of it. They don't get much. I mean, the most of them can hope for is that the bit of post office work will perhaps pay their rent for the shop they've got. And they share the staff. I mean, they may have people on post office work and people on non-post office work, but there are a few sub-office postmasters who do nothing but post office work and who get a living out of it. I think altogether there are about 20,000 of them. But I mean, the post office did it because it's cheaper. If they had to pay post office wages to all the sub-office post office staffs, it would cost them a lot more than they get. By farming it out, they'd get it done more cheaply.
But larger post offices would be owned by the
By the
post
state.
office.
The head post office. Well, it's now by the board,
Yeah.
post office
Yeah.
board.
Yes?
Would Comrade Harvey advise us to try and buy shares in TSB as part of the privatisation?
What price?
Well, the floating of the power.
As long as they don't sink.
What about British Airways?
That's gas.
What about water?
They're gambles like all the rest of it. As I would say, I mean, recently I had somebody asking me to explain these things to him, and I did put this to him. I said, look, every time somebody buys some shares because a broker, the expert, has said you should buy these shares, it's 9/10 likely that some other broker has told the seller you should sell these shares because they're not worth holding. Anything can happen.
Next.
Are we still on questions?
Discussion as
Oh,
well.
I see. What really a question?
Either, yeah.
I will do. Now, on this question of the privatisation obsession, I think one wouldn't be exaggerating to use that term, for the situation that we've got with the present government. Would you say that is just a fair reflection of the prevailing requirements of the capitalist state as it exists here at present, or is there perhaps some sort of crazy obsession that because a handful of individuals have managed to get into certain situations and obviously appear to have certain obsessional preoccupations, that this has taken over the policy of a capitalist administration? I mean, which is it, or is it perhaps a combination of both?
I said, well, it was a combination of both. You see, I've said Mrs. Thatcher is a 19th century Adam Smith liberal, and she therefore is in favour of competition. There are some other Tories, of course, with whom it's become an obsession. I mentioned when the President Winston Churchill wrote a letter at the time saying Tories are opposed to nationalisation because it's socialism, it's become an obsession with him. But I would say that as far as Thatcher herself and her immediate advisers are concerned, it is this problem of monopoly and competition. And she now sees that she thinks the way to get competition and to break up monopoly is not to nationalise them, but to use the anti-monopoly legislation and literally encourage competition. And you can see it's gone everywhere. I mean, by letting the building societies now invade the field of the banks, building societies can now be banks, and to let the banks invade the field of the building societies, and to take away the monopoly the solicitors had of conveyancing, throw this open. The Thatcher government is trying to encourage competition all over the place and in various other ways, and in deregistering the buses. See, the buses are now being taken out of the hands of local authorities and being open to competition. And the law will now allow Mercury to compete with British Telecom, although at the moment Mercury will only compete in telephone trunk lines. Later on, Mercury will move into the field of telephone services.
Right, you all agree with the case for socialism then? There's no dissent and there are no questions about socialism. You all agree capitalism is a bad thing, don't you?
Can I just say one or two things, Corin Chairman? For our friend at the back here, the latter part of his question, I think, concerned the possible effect that feminism is having on the Labour Party as a so-called capitalist party. Well, from my reading, and I must admit it's not all that deep, of the various feminist movements, they are by no means revolutionary. All of them accept and want capitalism, except they want it to be a little fairer to the women relative to the men. In short, their main point is, first of all, to try and get the men off their backs for a start, which is not possible within a capitalist system, but they want the same rights as men regarding wages, conditions of work, and various things like that. Now, that's got nothing to do with the abolition of capitalism. That's something which, if it's channeled through the Labour Party, is one of those things that is there to establish capitalism more securely as the social system of the day. So the so-called revolutionary role of the feminist movements, although at the very beginning of it there did seem some aspect of revolutionary concepts attached to them, that today, by and large, in my opinion anyway, has gone by the board, I would just like to say one or two things about privatisation. On this TSB, which I asked the question about, which they reckon they're going to pull in around about £1.5 billion, they anticipate that the cost of floating that thing, which of course goes to solicitors, banks, finance houses and things like that, is best part of £250 million. In short, the privatisation, which Thatcher is in favour of, is a very big money spinner for the finance houses and people of a similar character. Now, is the question of privatisation trying to make shares attractive and popular to the man in the street? And obviously this did have an effect when the British Telecom shares were floated, particularly those who bought them and then within a couple of months flogged the things and made quite a few pounds, incidentally, enough to pay for their summer holiday, and those who've still got them next year, they're going to get a £10 voucher. Is this an extension of home ownership, which has been flogged by the Conservative Party to the point, I think, the other day, Mrs. Thatcher, didn't she go to the millionth council house that has been sold, and they gave the chap a golden key kind of thing. But the number of council houses have been flogged off, and the benefits that the owner will get from it, namely a fantastic reduction in the market price. I think this is linked with the so-called popularity of the share movement, to give the workers some sort of stake in society. And obviously, if you start owning a house, you're against squatters for a start, because he might come into your house. You're against anything which might upset the general equilibrium and peace of society. And again, if you've got an odd share in British Telecom or TSB, might have a few in gas, you might win a British Airways, all this kind of thing more or less lines up your pattern of thought along the lines, well, we don't want to rock the boat. We're all in it together now, and if we pull our way, put in our fair day's work kind of thing, eventually we shall get out of it. I think this is all part and parcel of a deliberate policy of the Conservative Party, not to spread the wealth, because quite frankly it doesn't do that anyway, but to give people this idea that with a stake in society, they will much more be inclined to go along with the way in which capitalism runs and do their best to make sure nothing upsets it.
Well, no, just one thing was, in addition, I think it would be a vote catcher against the Labour Party, particularly.
Yes?
Can I just say in response to what Conrad said, there is quite a friction today between feminists who regard themselves as socialists and separatists, not only within the Labour Party, but within other parties who consider themselves socialists, however unscientific some of their tactics may be. So there is, and also there is a magazine on sale which can be bought in the high street called Spare Rib, which has set itself out as a magazine for women's liberation. So I would say what the picture our comrade gave us was not really a complete one.
Well, but the only thing about this, you see, if you say they regard themselves as socialists, what does this mean? You see, a lot of the Labourites who are now going to be committed to this new social ownership idea of nationalisation, if you would ask them point blank, is this socialism? They say, yes, we're socialists. So what does it mean? I mean, the only thing that is relevant to us is, are they really aiming at the only solution? It's not what you call it, but there is no solution to society's problems except to abolish buying and selling, to reduce it to its simplest form. Are they in favour of the abolition of buying and selling? If not, what does their claim to be socialist mean?
What I'm saying is that for a lot of, certainly of people of my generation, there is Labour is an alternative to the Conservative Party because it is just like the second level of capitalism. And I think that there is there has been a resurgence of of yes, Marxist ideas, not only within educational establishments but outside.
Because here again, what they mean by Marxist ideas, what do they mean bogus Marxism? I mean, 9/10 of these people who call themselves Marxists, no Marxism at all. It's just a term of, for them, I mean, it's a sort of rallying ground. For the Tories, it's just something they can attack. But what does it mean? Do these people, for example, vote against the capitalist parties? The Labour Party, the Tory Party, the Social Democratic Alliance. If they're socialists, they don't vote for anything. Socialists in no circumstances whatever ever put agents of capitalism into power. They don't do it. So when you say they call themselves socialists, and these others call themselves Marxists, who are they? Well, what do they do at elections? Communist Party? Are these some of the people? Communist Party who during the Second World War, by invitation, spoke on Tory party platforms, trying to get Tory candidates elected at by-elections. Socialist, Marxist? Of course not. It's just bogus.
Can I just say to our friend here, if these women were true feminists and they wanted equality with men, they'd be in the Socialist Party of Great Britain, because it's the only party where men and women are equal. Yes?
Well, you better put it more brutally. The feminists, these women who have these ideas, are only looking at the scene and think this is the best way for us to get a bigger share of the cake.
Yes, because in the practical political field, what it has led to or encouraged was all the various equality acts between men and women about equal pay and things like this. And the women have moved into getting equal pay for what are defined as the same jobs. And one of the results, which they didn't foresee but they ought to have done, was there are now a larger proportion of women are unemployed than there used to be. They've got more pay and they therefore are more quickly on the line for getting the sack when the employers want to cut down on staff. So the proportion of unemployed who are women has now risen. But I mean, this is capitalism, there's no answer to it.
Anyone else? Yes?
Yes, with the nationalisation, I mean, from a worker's point of view, the buying of these companies or the selling of these companies, really, is money's not involved in it at all, is it? But it gives him a spirit that he is a part of that concern for some unknown reason. But this is the same as our friend was saying there. If you do the opposite and let him buy a few shares, he's going to be very interested, even though he's only probably got 50 shares, to think, oh, this is my company, or even if he works in it. So really, it is a subtle way of capitalism operating, really, isn't it?
So of course it cuts both ways, you see, as you yourself recognise. When they nationalised these things, they said, I mean, Labour Party was full of it. You now own, this is your company. This is your mines, these are your railways, this is your Bank of England. There was a joke at the time of the Bank of England. Some journalist asked the Bank of England when they were nationalised what difference it made, and he said, well, it's difficult to find something, but I think they've changed the red tape to green or something like this, and that's all it did mean. But you see, the Labourites say the nationalised industries belong to you, therefore you should be loyal to them and not strike. Thatcher denationalises and sets up British Telecom and persuades workers to take their money away from under the mattress or out of the post office and buy some British Telecom shares, and she said, look, you've now got an interest in the company, which is of course what was behind all the profit sharing schemes in the past. They've got quite a long history and it's all the same, and of course workers should have nothing to do with either argument. They're both quite false.
Yeah, we're putting the cost of our telephone calls up as well.
It's rubbish about sharing, wider share ownership. Are there any figures I read an article once at the time, a couple of months ago, which in fact, I can't remember the figures at all, but this writer did show that there'd been virtually nothing changed in the disposal of share ownership, portions of share ownership, or the division in society of those who own shares and those who don't, despite the floating of all these BT and so on. In fact, he did point out, as you suggested earlier on, that people have bought shares, made a quick buck, and then big people who already own large blocks of all these shares bought them up. This is what it was all about. Is this, in fact, what's going on?
Well, I mean, some of the stock exchange people do claim that the number of small shareholders has increased. But I mean, there's still small shareholders that still don't count, so to speak. And of course, the basic figures doesn't make any difference to the distribution of wealth. The way the national income and national ownership change has nothing to do with this. If you've got some, if you've got some money in the post office and you decide to take it out and buy shares in TSB or something like this, you're not rich or poor, it doesn't make a difference.
No, I know that, but I read some figures that the share ownership was divided roughly with, I can't remember the figures, but it was a huge disproportion. The vast majority of the population didn't have any say whatsoever in the shares. And
I remember the figure I saw published was that 1,400,000, they reckon, of small shareholders. But this is peanuts. And of course, it's not only a small number compared with all the people who own shares, but the amount they own is so small that it doesn't matter anyway.
Right, I think you all feel you've had enough. Can I ask Comrade Hardy to answer Comrade Young's question now? And that's if he would like to.
What I suggest to Comrade Young, tell me, simplify it a bit. What is it you think might be worth
Well,
doing?
it's about the thing that we corresponded about. I thought it was very comical about the retail price.
Oh, retail.
Which is more or less the same argument, and its effect on young breweries and the cigarette manufacturers and so on. If you would like to explain.
Oh, well, it was just about resale price maintenance. Years ago, and I think it must have been, I'm not sure that it was the Labour Government Act, people complained that manufacturers were selling things to a retailer and saying, you must not sell this below the price we fixed. If you do sell it below the price we fixed, we won't supply you, we'll cut you off and you'll be out in the cold. And the resale price maintenance said that this is illegal. So that now a manufacturer cannot dictate to a retailer what the retailer is going to charge. And the people who moved it, whether they're Labour or Tory, doesn't matter, said that this would bring prices down. Well, I've followed the correspondence and statements made about Young's Brewery in Wandsworth. They have a number of public houses. Some of them are occupied by managers, and the others are tenants. Well, the Resale Price Act does not affect the tenants. According to the theory, therefore, since Young's cannot tell their tenants what they can charge, that the price would come down. And Young's complain that it hasn't. The tenants say, we'd rather sell a small quantity of beer at a very high price than sell a lot of beer at a low price. So Young's now have to put a notice in the press telling the people who go into their pubs, look, the price you're paying in the tenanted pubs is ever so much higher than the price you can get in our managed pubs. Because it's worked the opposite way. The managed pubs, where they do dictate the price, it's that those prices are lower and the tenanted prices were high. And of course the interesting thing is, this is what happens with lots of legislation. The theories come along and tell them what would happen, and what has happened has been precisely the reverse. It's gone the other way around. I was reminded, just in case I said something, I'm told that I possibly might have given the date of the Education Act as 1970. If I did, it's 1870.
Yeah, right. Comrades, I'd like to thank you for a collection of £24.75.
Comrade Hardy, dealing with trade and capitalism's wars, the socialist alternative.
Well, Mr. Chairman and comrades, before I get down to the subject in detail, it may help to get things in proper perspective if I briefly refer to a few background factors. The first one, which is most important, capitalism is not just a collection of manufacturers and traders selling commodities for profit. It is first and foremost a collection of 160 independent states, sovereign states as they call them, each with its armed forces to protect the privileged class against its own working class and against other states. Secondly, not all conflicts result in war. Sometimes a powerful country will be able to exact terms from some weaker one merely by the threat of war without actually going to war. Thirdly, and this is very much overlooked, there are usually divided interests inside the capitalist class in each country. One of them, for example, I shall refer to later, is the conflicting interest between the export capitalists, the people who make profits by exporting commodities, and the import capitalists who are working in the opposite direction. Each of them, of course, trying to influence the government to swing government policy in their direction. Fourthly, trade conflicts are not only about markets, that is exports, they are equally about imports and how countries succeed in getting them. Lastly, on these introductory points, while sometimes all the capitalists are in favour of a particular war that their government is going to engage in, it can also happen that they are deeply divided, and occasions have even happened when the capitalists are almost unitedly opposed to the war that their government is going to commit them to. I now come to a seeming paradox about wars. I suppose everybody will agree that nearly all the people in all the 160 countries in the world, if they were asked, would say that they want peace, not war. Yet when their governments go to war, most of these people will be found supporting their government. Now, and the question is, how does this come about? I have read a statement that says, and I quote, "It is people's fear and hatred that makes war possible." Well, of course, they've got the cart before the horse. When a government decides to go to war, it calls in all its resources of propaganda, usually backed by the political parties and the churches, to try to create fear and hatred among the population where they did not already exist. As I say, it isn't the fear and hatred that causes the war, it's the government going to war which deliberately creates fear and hatred. If the argument were really true, ask yourself a couple of questions. If human beings react violently against anybody who injures them, why don't the working class in all countries react violently against their exploiters whom they know? Why do they turn their fear and hatred, so to speak, against foreigners whom they in fact don't know? Secondly, the question arises that if it is human nature that seeks an outlet in war, why is it that about 90% of all the troops fighting in the two world wars have been conscripts? Why don't the people just rush forward into battle? Why does the government have to drag them in against their will to go and get slaughtered? There have been politicians who've used this argument. Benito Mussolini was one of them. He used to go around saying that it's people's violent passions that have to have an outlet in war. Well, Lowe, the cartoonist, did a quite telling cartoon on this. He showed a big hall with a packed audience and Mussolini bawling at them, "It's your violent passions that have to seek an outlet in war. War's your responsibility." But instead of Lowe showing the hall filled with excited Italians saying, "Yes, we want war, give us war," he got the hall filled with a lot of meek, frightened, passive-looking sheep. And this, of course, was the answer to Mussolini. But, of course, in the real world, the workers are sheepish to this extent, that when somebody like Mussolini comes along and tries to whip up support for a war, unfortunately, most of the workers allow themselves to be led astray by people like Mussolini. One thing you'll find about all the governments that go to war, almost all of them will use the argument that their particular government and their particular country are peace-loving, and that it's the foreigners who are forcing war on them. As Shakespeare put it, and I quote, "This happy breed of men, the envy of less happier lands." All the governments will present their wars in this sort of picture. Now, how does British history stand up to this amiable picture of Britain's wars? I jotted down a list of all the countries with which Britain has been at war. I got to 23, and I'm sure there are some I've left out. There's, in fact, more than 23. And going through the list in alphabetical order, it starts with Afghanistan, America, Abyssinia, goes on to the Boer republics of South Africa, and then through China, India, and so on. And right at the end of the list, in the alphabetical order, you get Tibet and the Zulus. Now I ask you, does it really sound sense that this peaceable lot of people living in the country where we happen to be have been surrounded all through their history by all these other countries filled with warlike people who keep on attacking the British way of life? I mean, the Afghans and the Zulus. What did they ever do to people living in London, for example? The answer is, of course, it's a piece of nonsense. But don't get it wrong. This is the picture of British capitalism's wars. But of course you get exactly the same picture if you look at the history of all the other countries. Their record is just the same. Now, capitalism is international. But capitalism does not unite the 160 nations, it divides them. And I start off with a quotation from Marx and Engels, who set the pattern for all of this. And I quote, "The bourgeoisie finds itself in constant battle at all times with the bourgeoisie of foreign countries." So why does capitalism cause conflict among all these people? Why is it true that the capitalist class in all countries are at all times in conflict with each other? We can start with the way all of these nations came into existence, and this also was dealt with by Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto. They called it political centralization, forcibly engineered by interested capitalist groups. And this is how Marx put it: in independent or but loosely connected provinces with separate interests, laws, governments and systems of taxation become lumped together into one nation with one government, one code of laws, one national class interest, one frontier and one customs tariff. That's how these nations were formed, all of them, all the 160. But this inevitably brings, as they're forming one of these nations, it inevitably brings them into conflict with their neighbours, because each of these groups trying to set up a nation, try to bring within their frontier a sufficiently large population, sufficient means to produce food and other things that they'll want for their industry, and also all of them trying to get an easily defended frontier, which of course all their neighbours are trying to do the same and come into conflict with them. There is always conflict about this, and very frequently wars. Look at the history, for example, in the 19th century, the wars that Italy was involved in the unification of Italy, or when Prussia unified Germany. They also had a series of wars with other people, as Denmark and Austria and so on, to set it up. Or look, in our own day, at India. Look at the formation of India, Pakistan and Bangladesh,